The moment Silas unfolded the letter and recognized his brother's handwriting, 15 years of silence shattered. Daniel had been alive long enough to father a son, and now that son stood shivering on his doorstep, orphaned and starving, with nothing but a dead man's final words to guide him home. The boy's whispered plea echoed in the cold October air. "Mama said to give this to a kind man." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The boy appeared on Silas Hargrove's porch like a ghost conjured from the October wind, small and shivering, clutching a folded piece of paper against his chest, as if it were the only thing keeping him tethered to this world. Silas had been stoking the fire when he heard the knock, so faint he almost mistook it for a branch scraping against the cabin wall. When he opened the door, the lamplight spilled out onto a child no more than 8 years old, with hollow cheeks and eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone so young. The boy's clothes were threadbare, patched in places where the fabric had worn through, and his boots were held together with twine and prayer. But it was the way he looked up at Silas, searching his weathered face with desperate hope, that stopped the rancher cold in his tracks. "Mama said to give this to a kind man," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible above the crackling fire behind Silas. He held out the folded paper with trembling hands, and Silas noticed the dirt beneath his fingernails, the scratches on his knuckles that spoke of a hard journey through unforgiving terrain. "She said I'd know him when I found him. She said he'd have eyes like the sky before a storm and hands that could gentle a wild horse." Silas Hargrove was not a man given to sentiment. At 42, he had spent the better part of 2 decades carving a life out of the Montana wilderness, building his ranch from nothing but determination and the stubborn refusal to let the land defeat him. He had buried a wife to fever, lost cattle to harsh winters, and watched his dreams of a family fade like morning mist over the mountains. The lines on his face told the story of those years, etched deep by sun and wind and grief. His beard had gone gray at the edges, and his blue-gray eyes, the color of storm clouds gathering on the horizon, had learned to look at the world with a guarded caution. But something about this boy, standing on his porch in the gathering dark, broke through the walls Silas had spent years constructing around his heart. "Come inside, son," he said, stepping back to let the child enter. "You'll catch your death out there." The boy hesitated, his eyes darting around the cabin's interior as if assessing potential dangers. Silas recognized that look, the wariness of a creature that had learned to expect harm from the world. It made something twist painfully in his chest. Whatever this child had been through, wherever he had come from, he had not been treated kindly by life. "I won't hurt you," Silas added, keeping his voice low and gentle, the same tone he used with skittish colts. "I've got stew warming on the stove. When did you last eat?" The question seemed to break something loose in the boy. His lower lip trembled, and for a moment Silas thought he might cry. But he squared his thin shoulders with a dignity that seemed far too old for his years, and stepped across the threshold into the warmth of the cabin. 3 days ago, maybe 4, the boy admitted. "There was a woman in the last town who gave me bread, but that was before I crossed the river." 3 or 4 days. Silas felt anger kindle in his belly, not at the child, but at whatever circumstances had left him wandering alone and hungry through the wilderness. The Montana Territory was unforgiving even for grown men with supplies and horses. For a boy this age to survive such a journey spoke of either remarkable luck or remarkable determination, perhaps both. He guided the child to a chair by the fire and ladled stew into a bowl, watching as the boy forced himself to eat slowly despite the obvious hunger gnawing at him. Someone had taught him manners, Silas noted. Someone had raised him to be polite even when his body screamed for sustenance. That spoke of a mother who cared, a mother who had taken the time to instill values in her son, even when times were hard. "What's your name, son?" "Elijah," the boy said between careful spoonfuls. "Elijah Hargrove." The name hit Silas like a physical blow. He gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles going white, as the implications crashed over him like a winter flood. Hargrove was not a common name in these parts. In fact, Silas knew of only one other person who had carried it, a person he had not seen or heard from in over 15 years. A person he had tried very hard not to think about during all those long, lonely years of building his ranch and bearing his sorrows and hard work. "Hargrove," he repeated, his voice coming out rough and strange. "Your father, what was his name?" The boy set down his spoon and looked at Silas with those old soul eyes, and for the first time the rancher noticed something familiar in their shape, in the stubborn set of the child's jaw. Features he had seen every day of his childhood, reflected in a face that shared his blood. "Daniel," Elijah said quietly. "Daniel Hargrove. Mama said he died before I was born, but she kept his name. She said it was important that I know where I came from, even if I never got to know him. Daniel." The name was a key that unlocked a door Silas had kept firmly shut for 15 years, releasing a flood of memories he had worked so hard to dam. Daniel, his younger brother by 3 years. Daniel, with his easy laugh and his restless spirit, and his determination to seek his fortune in the California goldfields, despite Silas's warnings about the dangers that awaited. Daniel, who had ridden away one spring morning with promises to write, to send money, to come back someday and help Silas build the ranch into something magnificent. The letters had come sporadically at first, tales of hardship and hope from the mining camps, stories of fortunes made and lost in the span of a single day. Then they had stopped entirely, and despite his inquiries, despite the money he had spent on investigators and notices in distant newspapers, Silas had never learned what became of his brother. He had eventually accepted that Daniel was dead, another victim of the brutal mathematics of the frontier, where dreams went to die in unmarked graves scattered across a continent hungry for gold. But here was proof that Daniel had lived long enough to father a child, to build some kind of life before whatever fate had finally claimed him. "The letter," Silas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Let me see it." Elijah reached into his shirt and withdrew the folded paper he had been carrying so carefully. It was worn soft with handling, the creases threatening to tear from being opened and closed so many times. The boy placed it in Silas's calloused hands with the solemnity of someone entrusting a sacred relic to a priest. Silas unfolded the paper with trembling fingers, and there, in handwriting he had not seen in 15 years, but would recognize anywhere, were the words his brother had left behind. The fire crackled and popped, casting dancing shadows across the walls as Silas began to read, the past and present colliding in the simple sentences of a dead man's final message to the brother he had never stopped loving, even across all those miles and all those years of silence. The letter was dated nearly 2 years ago, the ink faded but still legible in Daniel's familiar scrawl. Silas remembered how their mother had always scolded Daniel for his messy handwriting, insisting that a man's penmanship reflected his character. But to Silas, those imperfect letters were more precious than any carefully crafted calligraphy could ever be. They were proof that his brother had lived, had breathed, had put pen to paper with thoughts of family still in his heart. "Dear Silas," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then I've gone to meet our Maker, and my boy has found his way to you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness for all the years of silence, for all the letters I should have written and didn't, for all the promises I made and broke. But I'm not asking forgiveness for myself. I'm asking you to look at my son, at Elijah, and see in him what I could never be. He's the best thing I ever did in this world, brother. The only thing I got right. His mama, Sarah, she's writing this down for me because my hands don't work so good anymore. The sickness took my strength months ago, and the doctor says I won't see another spring. But Sarah, she's strong. She'll get Elijah to you. She promised me, and Sarah never breaks a promise." Silas had to stop reading for a moment, his vision blurring with tears he refused to let fall. The boy was watching him with those knowing eyes, waiting with patience that seemed impossible for someone so young. The fire crackled in the silence, and somewhere outside, a coyote called to its pack across the darkening prairie. "Sarah," Silas said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. "Your mother, where is she now?" The light in Elijah's eyes dimmed, and Silas knew the answer before the boy spoke. He had seen that particular shade of grief too many times in his life, worn it himself for too many years after his own wife had passed. It was the look of someone who had learned that love was no protection against loss, that the people we cherish most can be taken from us without warning or reason. She got sick on the journey, Elijah said quietly, his small hands clasped together in his lap. Fever came on fast, 3 weeks out of Sacramento. There was a doctor in a mining town who tried to help, but she was already too far gone. She made me promise to keep going, to find you no matter what. Said you were the only family I had left, and that you'd take care of me because that's what Hargroves do. They take care of their own. The words hit Silas with the force of a winter storm. This child had not only lost his father before birth, but had watched his mother die on a desperate journey across hundreds of miles of unforgiving wilderness. He had continued alone, an 8-year-old boy navigating dangers that would challenge grown men, driven by nothing but a promise made to a dying woman and a letter addressed to an uncle he had never met. Silas returned to the letter, needing to hear his brother's voice, even if it came only through words on paper. I found gold once, brother. Not much, but enough to buy a small claim and build a cabin for Sarah and me. We were happy for a time, happier than I deserved after all my foolish wandering. She saw something in me worth loving, though God knows I never understood what. When she told me about the baby, I thought my heart would burst with joy. A son, Silas. Someone to carry on our name, to be better than his old man ever was. I wanted to bring them both to Montana, to show you that I'd finally grown up, finally become someone you could be proud of. But the sickness came before I could make good on that dream, and now all I can do is send you my greatest treasure and pray that you'll love him as your own. The letter continued, but Silas's hands were shaking too badly to hold the paper steady. He set it down on the table and looked at Elijah, really looked at him, seeing past the dirt and exhaustion to the child beneath. There was Daniel in the shape of his nose, in the way his hair curled slightly at the temples. But there was something else too, a strength and determination that must have come from his mother, the woman who had kept her promise even unto death. Your mama, Silas said softly. She must have been one hell of a woman. For the first time since arriving, Elijah smiled, a small, fragile expression that transformed his face. She was. She taught me to read and write, even though we didn't have many books. She said education was the one thing no one could take from you, no matter how poor you got or how far you fell. She used to tell me stories about Papa, about how he could make her laugh even when times were hard, about how he talked about you in Montana, and the ranch he dreamed of building someday. Silas felt his throat tighten. Daniel had talked about him, had thought about him during all those years of silence, had carried memories of their shared childhood into the new life he was building in California. The knowledge was both balm and blade, healing and wounding in equal measure. There's more to the letter, Elijah said, nodding toward the paper. Mama read it to me so many times I have it memorized. The part at the end is the most important. Papa wanted you to know something he said he should have told you before he left. Silas picked up the letter again, turning to the final paragraph. The handwriting here was shakier, as if Daniel had been fighting against his failing body to get the words out. I never told you why I really left, Silas. It wasn't just the gold fever, though I let you believe that. The truth is I was scared of never being good enough, of always living in your shadow. You were the strong one, the responsible one, the one Pa counted on to keep the family together after Ma died. I ran because staying meant facing how much I disappointed everyone, including myself. But I want you to know that not a day went by when I didn't think about you, when I didn't wish I had your courage. Take care of my boy, brother. Teach him to be like you, not like me, and if you can find it in your heart, forgive me. Your loving brother, Daniel. The cabin fell silent except for the whisper of flames and the distant howl of wind across the prairie. Silas carefully refolded the letter, his mind churning with 15 years of questions that would never be answered and regrets that could never be undone. But sitting across from him was a child who needed him, a living connection to the brother he had lost twice, once to distance and once to death. That first night, Silas gave Elijah his own bed and sat in the chair by the fire, watching the flames die down to embers as he turned his brother's words over in his mind. Sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Daniel's face as it had been 15 years ago, young and eager and burning with dreams of fortune and adventure. He saw his own hand raised in farewell, heard his own voice telling Daniel to write often, to stay safe, to come home when he had made his mark on the world. He had never imagined that farewell would be their last, that the next time he heard from his brother would be through a letter delivered by an orphaned child. The boy slept fitfully, crying out in his dreams, calling for a mother who would never answer. Silas went to him 3 times during the night, laying a calloused hand on his forehead, murmuring words of comfort that felt clumsy and inadequate. He had no experience with children. His marriage to Elizabeth had been brief and childless, ended by the fever that swept through the territory the 2nd year after their wedding. He had mourned her, rebuilt his life around work and solitude, and eventually stopped imagining the family they might have had together. Now fate had delivered a child to his doorstep, a boy who carried his brother's blood and his brother's name, who had traveled hundreds of miles on the strength of a promise and the hope of finding home. Silas did not know if he was capable of being the father this child needed. He only knew that turning Elijah away was not something he could do, not while his brother's letter lay folded on the table like a sacred covenant between the living and the dead. Morning came gray and cold, the October sun struggling to break through clouds that promised early snow. Silas had coffee brewing and bacon frying when Elijah emerged from the bedroom, his clothes wrinkled from sleep and his hair standing up in wild tufts. In the daylight, the boy looked even thinner than he had the night before, his wrists like bird bones beneath skin that was pale from exhaustion and poor nutrition. The journey had taken more from him than Silas had initially realized, and something protective stirred in his chest at the sight. "Hungry?" Silas asked, keeping his voice casual. Elijah nodded, sliding into the chair he had occupied the night before. His eyes moved around the cabin with renewed curiosity, taking in details he had been too tired to notice during his arrival. The mounted elk antlers above the fireplace, the rifle hanging on pegs by the door, the single daguerreotype on the mantel showing a young couple on their wedding day, the woman's face soft with happiness, the man's expression caught somewhere between pride and disbelief at his good fortune. "Is that your wife?" Elijah asked, pointing to the photograph. Silas glanced at the image of Elizabeth, preserved forever in silver and glass, forever young and forever beyond his reach. "Was," he said simply. "She passed a long time ago. Fever took her." The boy absorbed this information with the gravity of someone who understood loss intimately. "Mama said fever is what took Papa too. She said it wasn't fair, that he was too young and too good to die that way. But I think she was just trying to make me feel better about never meeting him." Silas set a plate of bacon and biscuits in front of the boy and poured him a cup of milk from the cold cellar. "Your papa was a lot of things, but I'm not sure good was always one of them. He had a wild streak a mile wide and a talent for finding trouble wherever he went. Used to drive our mother to distraction with his schemes and adventures." "Really?" Elijah's eyes lit up with hunger of a different kind, a desperate need to know the father who had died before he was born. "What kind of schemes?" And so, over breakfast in the small cabin with the Montana wind rattling the windows, Silas began to tell stories he had not thought about in years. He told Elijah about the time Daniel had tried to train a raccoon as a pet and ended up with scratches covering both arms and a mother who refused to speak to him for a week. He told him about the summer Daniel had convinced 3 neighbor boys to help him build a raft, promising them a fortune in beaver pelts from the river, only to have the contraption sink within 10 feet of the shore. He told him about the pranks and the laughter, the fights and the reconciliations, the 1,000 small moments that had made up their shared childhood before the world had pulled them apart. Elijah listened with rapt attention, soaking up every detail like parched earth drinking rain. His questions were endless. What did Papa look like? What was his favorite food? Did he have a horse? Could he shoot a rifle? Was he brave? Silas answered as honestly as he could, painting a portrait of a brother who had been flawed and foolish and ultimately redeemed by the love he had found in California. "He loved your mother very much," Silas said finally, pushing back from the table as the morning sun finally broke through the clouds. That much is clear from his letter. And he loved you too. Even though he never got to hold you in his arms, he wanted you to have a better life than he did. That's why he sent you to me. Elijah was quiet for a long moment, processing this information with the same careful consideration he had shown the night before. Then he looked up at Silas with those old soul eyes and asked the question that had clearly been weighing on him since his arrival. Are you going to keep me? The bluntness of it took Silas's breath away. Not do you want me or can I stay, but are you going to keep me? As if the boy were a stray dog or an unwanted piece of furniture that could be discarded at will. It spoke of a life where permanence was never guaranteed, where love was always conditional, where even a mother's promise might not be enough to secure a place in the world. Silas knelt down so that he was eye level with his nephew, his knees protesting the cold floor, but his heart demanding the gesture. He put his hands on the boy's thin shoulders and looked directly into his face. You're a Hargrove, he said firmly. This is your home now, and I don't give up on family. The first weeks were not easy. Silas had grown accustomed to solitude the way a man grows accustomed to an old wound, learning to work around it until he almost forgets it is there. Having a child in the cabin disrupted rhythms he had not even realized he had established. Elijah was quiet for the most part, careful not to take up too much space or make too much noise, but his presence filled the small home in ways that Silas found both unsettling and strangely comforting. There was someone to cook for now, someone to consider when planning the day's work, someone whose needs extended beyond the simple requirements of cattle and horses. The boy proved useful around the ranch, eager to learn and quick to follow instructions. Silas taught him to gather eggs from the henhouse, to pump water from the well, to stack firewood in neat rows against the coming winter. Elijah approached each task with fierce determination, as if proving his worth was the only way to ensure his place in this new life. It broke Silas's heart to see such anxiety in someone so young, but he understood it. The boy had lost everything, had traveled across a continent with nothing but hope and a letter. Of course, he was afraid of being sent away. You don't have to work so hard, Silas told him one afternoon, watching Elijah struggle to lift a bucket of water that was clearly too heavy for his thin arms. You're not a hired hand, you're family. Mama said everyone has to earn their keep, Elijah replied, his face red with exertion. She said there's no shame in hard work, only in laziness. Your mama was right about that, but there's also no shame in asking for help when something's too heavy. Silas took the bucket from the boy's straining hands and carried it the rest of the way to the trough. Part of being family is knowing you don't have to do everything alone. The words seemed to land somewhere deep in Elijah's consciousness. He was quiet for the rest of the afternoon, but that night at dinner he asked Silas to tell him more stories about Daniel. It became their ritual, those evening conversations by the fire. Silas would share memories of his brother while Elijah listened with hungry attention, building a picture of the father he had never known from fragments and anecdotes. In turn, Elijah began to share stories of his mother. Sarah had been a schoolteacher's daughter from Ohio who had come west with her family seeking opportunity and found instead hardship and loss. Her parents had died in a cholera outbreak, leaving her alone in a mining town with nothing but her education and her determination to survive. She had met Daniel when he stumbled into the general store where she worked, bleeding from a mining accident and too stubborn to admit he needed help. She had bandaged his wounds and scolded him for his recklessness, and he had fallen in love with her sharp tongue and gentle hands. She used to say Papa was the most infuriating man she'd ever met, Elijah recounted, a small smile playing at his lips. But she said it like it was a compliment, like being infuriating was actually something to be proud of. Silas laughed, the sound surprising him with its warmth. That sounds like Daniel. He had a gift for making people crazy and making them love him for it. Our mother used to say he could charm the spots off a leopard if he put his mind to it. The mention of their grandmother sparked new questions, and Silas found himself reaching back into memories he had buried for decades. He told Elijah about the small farm in Missouri where he and Daniel had grown up, about parents who had worked themselves to exhaustion trying to provide for their sons, about the dreams that had driven them west when the farm finally failed. Their mother had died on the journey, taken by the same fever that seemed to claim so many lives on the frontier. Their father had lasted another 5 years before his heart gave out, leaving Silas alone at 22 with a half-built cabin and a determination to make something of the land that had cost his family so much. "Papa never talked about any of that," Elijah said quietly. "Mama said he didn't like to remember the sad things." "That was Daniel's way," Silas agreed. "He always wanted to look forward, never back. I think the past was too heavy for him to carry. That's part of why he left Montana. He wanted to start fresh somewhere that didn't remind him of everything that we'd lost." As October gave way to November, the first snows began to fall, light dustings that painted the prairie white and warned of harsher weather to come. Silas worked from dawn to dusk preparing for winter, repairing fences, storing feed, ensuring the cattle had shelter from the coming storms. Elijah helped where he could and watched where he could not, absorbing knowledge about ranching with the same intensity he brought to everything. The boy's formal education had been spotty, Silas discovered. Sarah had taught him to read and write, but there had been no money for proper schooling, no time between survival and struggle to focus on arithmetic or history. Silas was no teacher, but he remembered enough from his own childhood lessons to begin working with Elijah in the evenings, scratching letters and numbers on a slate by firelight while the wind howled outside. "You're smart," Silas told him after a particularly successful session with multiplication tables. "Your mama was right about education. A man who can read and cipher has options, a ignorant man doesn't." "Did Papa know how to read?" Elijah asked. "He did. Our mother insisted on it, even when there was barely enough daylight left after chores for lessons. She used to say that books were windows into other worlds, and she wanted her sons to be able to look through as many windows as possible." Elijah considered this for a moment. "I wish I could have met her, grandmother, I mean. She sounds like she was kind." "She was. She would have loved you, Elijah. Would have spoiled you rotten and told you stories until you fell asleep." Silas reached out and ruffled the boy's hair, the gesture feeling more natural than it would have even a few weeks ago. "She would have been proud that you found your way here, proud that the Hargrove name is going to continue." That night, after Elijah had gone to bed, Silas sat alone by the fire with his brother's letter in his hands. He had read it so many times now that he could recite it from memory, but there was something comforting about seeing Daniel's handwriting, about touching paper that his brother had touched. The grief was still there, would probably always be there, but it had begun to transform into something else, purpose perhaps, responsibility, the knowledge that his brother's legacy was sleeping in the next room, and that caring for that legacy was the most important task Silas had ever been given. The first real test came 3 weeks after Elijah's arrival, when Silas took the boy to town for supplies. Cedar Falls was not much to look at, just a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of other buildings that served the ranchers and farmers spread across the valley. But to Elijah, who had spent months traveling through wilderness and mining camps, it must have seemed like a proper civilization. His eyes went wide as they rode past the buildings, taking in the horses tied to hitching posts, the women in their Sunday dresses, the children playing in the dusty street. Silas had not thought much about how his sudden acquisition of a child would appear to his neighbors. He had lived alone for so long that the opinions of others rarely crossed his mind. But as they dismounted outside the general store, he became aware of eyes following them, of whispered conversations halting mid-sentence, of the particular silence that falls over small towns when something unusual occurs. "That the Hargrove place?" a woman asked her companion, loud enough for Silas to hear. "I didn't know he had a son." "He doesn't," came the reply. "Or didn't. Lord knows where that child came from." Silas felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his expression neutral as he guided Elijah into the store. The boy had heard the comments too. Silas could tell by the way his shoulders hunched slightly, the way he moved closer to his uncle's side. It was a familiar posture, the body language of someone accustomed to being talked about, judged, found wanting. Inside the store, Harold Pemberton looked up from his ledger with raised eyebrows. He was a thin man with spectacles perpetually sliding down his nose and a memory for gossip that would have put any newspaper to shame. His eyes moved from Silas to Elijah and back again, calculating, curious, already composing the story he would tell his next customer. "Silas Hargrove," he said slowly. "And who might this young man be?" "This is my nephew, Elijah," Silas replied, his tone making clear that further questions were not welcome. "He'll be living with me from now on. I need flour, salt, coffee, and whatever fabric you have that might work for making a boy some proper winter clothes." The mention of nephew sparked visible surprise on Pemberton's face. "Nephew? I didn't know you had any family left." "My brother Daniel's son. Daniel passed away in California, and the boy's mother brought him to me before she died as well." Silas met the shopkeeper's gaze steadily. "He's a Hargrove, and he belongs with family." The firmness in his voice seemed to settle something. Pemberton nodded slowly, then turned his attention to gathering the requested supplies. But Silas knew the story would spread through Cedar Falls like wildfire by nightfall. By morning, everyone in the valley would know that the solitary rancher had taken in an orphan nephew, and opinions would form based on nothing more than speculation and boredom. Elijah remained quiet through the transaction, staying close to Silas while trying to appear invisible. It was only when they passed the window of the small bakery next door that the boy showed any reaction, his steps slowing as the smell of fresh bread wafted through the glass. "You like sweets?" Silas asked, noting the longing in Elijah's expression. "Mama used to make honey cakes for special occasions," Elijah said softly. "When there was money for honey, anyway." Silas steered him toward the bakery door. "Then we'd better get you something sweet. Consider it a special occasion." The look on Elijah's face when Silas bought him a sugar cookie was worth every penny of the extravagance. He ate it slowly, savoring each bite, making the small treat last far longer than most children would have managed. Silas watched him with a mixture of tenderness and sorrow, thinking of all the deprivations this boy had endured, all the simple pleasures that had been beyond his reach. They were loading the supplies onto the wagon when a voice called out across the street. "Silas Hargrove, hold up a moment." Silas turned to see Reverend Thomas approaching, his black coat flapping in the November wind. The Reverend was a portly man with kind eyes and a genuine concern for his flock that had earned him respect even from those who rarely darkened the church's doorstep. Silas had attended services sporadically over the years, more out of habit than conviction, but he had always found the Reverend to be a decent man. "I heard you have a young visitor," the Reverend said, slightly out of breath from hurrying across the street. His eyes moved to Elijah with warm curiosity. "Word travels fast in Cedar Falls." "My nephew," Silas confirmed. "My brother's son from California. I was sorry to hear about Daniel. I know you two were close once upon a time." The Reverend knelt down to bring himself to Elijah's eye level, a gesture that immediately raised him in Silas's estimation. "And what's your name, young man?" "Elijah, sir. Elijah Hargrove." "A fine biblical name. Do you know the story of the prophet Elijah?" Elijah shook his head, and the Reverend smiled kindly. "He was a man of great faith who stood alone against powerful enemies. God took care of him when no one else would, sending ravens to bring him food in the wilderness. Perhaps there's something of that prophet in you, traveling all this way to find your family." The comparison seemed to please Elijah, and Silas felt grateful to the Reverend for his thoughtfulness. Not everyone in Cedar Falls would be so welcoming, he knew. There would be questions about the boy's legitimacy, whispers about whether Daniel had actually married Elijah's mother, speculation about what kind of life the child had led before arriving in Montana. Small towns could be cruel in their curiosity, especially toward those who did not fit neatly into expected categories. "The boy will need schooling," the Reverend continued, straightening up to address Silas directly. "Miss Adelaide Winters runs a small school for the children in the valley. I could speak with her on your behalf if you like." Silas hesitated. He had not thought about formal education, had been content with his evening lessons by the fire. But Elijah deserved more than what Silas could provide, deserved the chance to learn properly and to be around other children his age. "I'd appreciate that," he said finally. Education was important to his mother. I'd like to honor her wishes. Miss Adelaide Winters was not what Silas had expected. When the Reverend had mentioned a schoolteacher, he had pictured someone like the stern matrons of his own childhood education. Gray-haired women with pinched faces who wielded rulers like weapons and tolerated no nonsense. Instead, he found himself facing a young woman of perhaps 28, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that sparkled with intelligence and warmth. She received them in the small building that served as Cedar Falls Schoolhouse, a single room with rows of mismatched desks and a chalkboard that had seen better days. "So this is Elijah," she said, kneeling down to greet the boy with the same natural ease the Reverend had shown. "Reverend Thomas told me about you. He said you traveled a very long way to get here." Elijah nodded, his initial shyness giving way to curiosity as he took in the books lining the walls, the maps hanging from pegs, the small globe sitting on Miss Winters' desk. "My mama taught me to read," he offered, "and Uncle Silas has been teaching me numbers." "Has he now?" Miss Winters glanced up at Silas with what might have been approval. "Well, we'll see where you are and go from there. Every child learns at their own pace, and there's no shame in needing extra help with some things." The school operated 3 days a week, Miss Winters explained, with students ranging from 6 to 14 years old. Most were children of farmers and ranchers, their education squeezed between chores and seasonal demands. Attendance was irregular, especially during planting and harvest, but Miss Winters maintained that some learning was better than none, and she adapted her lessons to accommodate the realities of frontier life. "He can start Monday," she told Silas as they prepared to leave. "I'll assess his reading and arithmetic and develop a plan from there. Your brother's wife did well by him, from what I can see. He's bright and curious, which is half the battle." Silas thanked her and guided Elijah back to the wagon, but something made him pause at the door. "Miss Winters," he said, turning back, "the boy's been through a lot. Lost both parents, traveled alone for weeks. If any of the other children give him trouble—" "I don't tolerate cruelty in my classroom, Mr. Hargrove." Her voice carried steel beneath its pleasant surface. "Every child deserves to learn in safety, regardless of their circumstances. Elijah will be protected here." The promise eased something in Silas's chest that he had not realized was tight. He nodded his thanks and led Elijah out into the pale November sunshine. Monday came with a fresh dusting of snow and a knot of anxiety in Silas's stomach that surprised him with its intensity. He had faced down blizzards, drought, and the threat of bankruptcy without flinching, but the thought of sending Elijah into a room full of strangers made him want to keep the boy home where he knew he would be safe. It was irrational, he told himself. Children went to school every day. It was normal, necessary, nothing to worry about. But Elijah was not just any child. He was Daniel's son, the last piece of his brother left in this world, and the thought of him being hurt or mocked or made to feel unwelcome was almost more than Silas could bear. "You don't have to go if you don't want to," he found himself saying as they rode toward town. "I can keep teaching you at home. Miss Winters would understand." Elijah was quiet for a moment, his small face serious beneath the 2 large hats Silas had given him to keep off the cold. "Mama wanted me to go to school," he said finally. "She said it was important. She said being scared was no reason not to do something that mattered." The wisdom in those words, delivered with such simple conviction, shamed Silas into silence. This 8-year-old boy had more courage than he did, more faith in the necessity of moving forward despite fear. It was a reminder that Elijah was not fragile, not breakable, not in need of protection from every possible harm. He had survived things that would have broken many adults. He could certainly survive a schoolroom. The first days were difficult, as Silas had feared they might be. Elijah came home quiet and withdrawn, answering questions about his classes in monosyllables, eating his dinner in silence before retreating to bed earlier than usual. Silas wanted to press him, to demand to know what had happened, who had hurt him, what cruel words had been spoken. But he remembered his own childhood, the fierce pride that had made him reluctant to admit weakness or ask for help. He gave Elijah space, remained available without pushing, and waited for the boy to come to him on his own terms. It took a week before the story emerged. Silas was mending a harness by the fire when Elijah appeared in the doorway of his room, his face pale in the lamplight. "They say I'm a bastard," he said flatly. "The other children, they say my parents weren't really married. That's why I don't have any papers or anything to prove who I am. They say you only took me in because you felt sorry for me, not because I'm really family." The words hit Silas like a physical blow. He set down the harness and opened his arms, and Elijah flew across the room to bury himself against his uncle's chest. The boy's shoulders shook with sobs he had been holding in for days, and Silas held him tight, letting him cry out the pain and humiliation while rage built slowly in his own heart. "Listen to me," he said, when Elijah's tears had subsided to hiccups. "Your parents were married. Your father's letter tells me so, and your father never lied to me about important things. You are a Hargrove by blood and by right, and no ignorant child's cruelty can change that." "But I don't have proof," Elijah whispered. "There's no marriage certificate, no birth record, nothing. Mama had to leave everything behind when we ran out of money." Silas pulled back and cupped the boy's face in his calloused hands, forcing Elijah to meet his eyes. "You have the letter. You have your father's handwriting, your father's words, and you have me." His voice was fierce with conviction. "I know who you are, Elijah Hargrove, and anyone who says different will answer to me." The next morning, Silas rode into town with a purpose that made his jaw tight and his eyes hard. He left Elijah at home with strict instructions to tend the chickens and stay warm, promising to return before midday. The boy had protested, wanting to accompany him, but Silas had been firm. This was a conversation that needed to happen without Elijah present, without the boy having to witness whatever unpleasantness might unfold. Miss Winters was alone in the schoolhouse when he arrived, preparing lessons for the day's classes. She looked up at the sound of his boots on the wooden floor, and something in his expression must have told her why he had come, because her own face grew serious. "Mr. Hargrove, I assume this is about Elijah." "You assume correctly." Silas removed his hat and stood before her desk, struggling to keep his voice level. "My nephew came home yesterday and told me the other children have been calling him a bastard, saying his parents weren't married, that he doesn't belong here." Miss Winters set down her chalk and folded her hands, her green eyes meeting his steadily. "I'm aware of the situation. I overheard some of the comments yesterday and addressed them with the students involved. I made clear that such language and cruelty would not be tolerated. And yet, it happened." Silas heard the anger in his own voice and forced himself to take a breath. "You told me he would be protected here. I told you I don't tolerate cruelty, and I don't. But I cannot control what children say when my back is turned, Mr. Hargrove. I cannot follow each student home and ensure they speak kindly of their classmates around the dinner table." She stood, coming around the desk to face him directly. "Children can be cruel because their parents are cruel. The whispers about Elijah didn't start in this classroom. They started in the parlors and kitchens of Cedar Falls, where adults with too much time and too little charity decided to question the legitimacy of a grieving child." The truth of her words deflated some of Silas's anger, replacing it with a wearier frustration. She was right, of course. The children were only repeating what they had heard at home, parroting the suspicions and judgments of their elders. The real problem was not in this schoolroom, but in the hearts of people who should know better. "What would you have me do?" he asked quietly. Miss Winters studied him for a long moment, her expression thoughtful. "Bring the letter," she said finally. "Daniel's letter, the one Elijah carried all the way from California. Let me read it to the class with your permission and Elijah's. Let them hear a father's words about his son, a dying man's plea to his brother. Children are cruel, but they are also capable of empathy when their hearts are properly engaged." The suggestion startled Silas. The letter was private, sacred, a communication between brothers that he had never intended to share with anyone outside the family. But Miss Winters was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and he could see the wisdom in her proposal. Stories had power, words had power. If Daniel's letter could change how the children of Cedar Falls saw Elijah, perhaps the temporary exposure of private grief was a price worth paying. "I'll speak with Elijah," he said. It should be his choice. That evening, Silas sat with his nephew by the fire and explained Miss Winter's idea. He expected resistance, expected Elijah to recoil from the thought of his father's intimate words being read aloud to the very children who had tormented him. But the boy surprised him, as he so often did. "Papa wanted people to know I belonged," Elijah said slowly, turning the idea over in his mind. "He wanted you to know, but maybe he wanted everyone to know. Maybe that's why he wrote it down instead of just telling Mama to say things for him." The insight was remarkable for someone so young, and Silas felt a swell of pride that had nothing to do with blood or obligation. This child was extraordinary, not despite his hardships, but perhaps because of them. Suffering had forged in him a depth of understanding that many adults never achieved. "Are you sure?" Silas pressed. "Once the words are spoken, they can't be taken back. Everyone will know our family's business." "Everyone already thinks they know our business," Elijah replied with a maturity that broke Silas's heart. "They just have it wrong. Maybe if they hear the truth, they'll stop making up stories." So it was decided. The following Monday, Silas accompanied Elijah to school, the letter tucked carefully inside his coat. Miss Winters had prepared the children, explaining that Elijah's uncle had something important to share with them. The room fell silent as Silas took his place at the front of the class, 24 young faces staring up at him with expressions ranging from curiosity to guilt. He cleared his throat and began to speak, not reading from the letter yet, but setting the stage for what would come. He told them about Daniel, about the brother who had left Montana 15 years ago seeking fortune and adventure. He told them about the silence that had stretched between them, the years of wondering, the grief of not knowing what had become of someone he loved. And then he unfolded the letter and began to read, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. The words filled the small schoolroom, Daniel's final testament to brotherhood and fatherhood, and the fierce love that had driven him to send his son across a continent to find family. Silas watched the children's faces as he read, saw the shifting expressions, the dawning comprehension, the tears that began to slip down more than one young cheek. When he finished, the silence was profound. Then a boy in the back row, one of Elijah's chief tormentors according to Miss Winters, raised his hand. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice small but sincere. "I didn't know. I'm sorry for what I said." Others followed, a chorus of apologies that washed over Elijah like healing rain. Silas watched his nephew receive each one with grace, nodding solemnly, offering forgiveness without hesitation. In that moment he saw Sarah's influence clearly, the mother who had raised her son to be kind even to those who had been unkind to him. Miss Winters caught Silas's eye across the room and smiled, a warm expression that conveyed both gratitude and something else, something he was not quite ready to name. The reading of Daniel's letter marked a turning point, not just for Elijah but for Silas as well. The children of Cedar Falls accepted the boy into their ranks with the swift forgiveness that only the young seemed capable of mustering. Within weeks, Elijah had formed friendships that would have seemed impossible during those first painful days. He came home with stories of games played during recess, of jokes shared over lunch, of a boy named Thomas who had invited him to go fishing when the spring thaw came. But there was another change, subtler and more unexpected, that began to work its way into Silas's carefully ordered life. Miss Adelaide Winters had taken an interest in Elijah's education that went beyond professional duty. She sent home extra books for him to read, wrote notes praising his progress, and occasionally stopped by the ranch on her way back from visiting students in the outlying areas. At first, Silas told himself these visits were purely about the boy, about ensuring that Elijah's learning continued outside the classroom. But as winter deepened and the visits became more frequent, he began to notice things that had nothing to do with education. The way Adelaide's eyes crinkled when she laughed, the graceful movements of her hands as she gestured while telling a story, the genuine interest she showed in the workings of the ranch, asking questions about cattle and crops and the endless challenges of frontier life. "You're staring again," Elijah observed one evening after Adelaide had departed, leaving behind a new book about explorers and a plate of cookies she had baked for them. Silas felt heat rise to his cheeks, an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had long ago learned to control his expressions. "I don't know what you mean." "You look at Miss Winters the way Reverend Thomas looks at the collection plate," Elijah said with devastating honesty. "Like you're hoping for something good but afraid to ask for it." The observation was so accurate that Silas could not find words to deny it. He had buried his heart with Elizabeth, or so he had believed. The years of solitude had convinced him that romantic love was a chapter of his life that had closed permanently. Yet here was this woman, this kind and intelligent and unexpectedly beautiful woman, stirring feelings he had thought long dead. "It wouldn't be appropriate," he said finally, more to himself than to Elijah. "She's young, educated, full of life. What would she want with a worn-out rancher twice her age?" "You're not twice her age," Elijah pointed out reasonably. "And she keeps finding reasons to visit. The books she brings are just excuses. I heard Mrs. Patterson say so at the general store." Silas groaned inwardly. If the town gossips had noticed Adelaide's visits, the situation was already more complicated than he had realized. The last thing he wanted was to damage her reputation by association with him, to give the wagging tongues of Cedar Falls more ammunition against someone who had shown his family nothing but kindness. He resolved to distance himself, to make their interactions purely formal, to protect Adelaide from whatever speculation might arise. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. The blizzard struck in early February with a ferocity that caught even experienced ranchers off guard. Silas had seen bad storms before, had weathered them in this very cabin with nothing but stubbornness and preparation. But this one was different. A howling white monster that reduced visibility to nothing and dropped temperatures to levels that could kill a man in minutes. He was securing the barn, making sure the livestock had feed and shelter, when he heard something that made his blood freeze colder than any wind. A voice, faint and desperate, calling out across the white void. Someone was out there in the storm, lost and almost certainly dying. Silas grabbed a rope, tied one end to the barn door, and plunged into the blizzard with the other end wrapped around his waist. The cold hit him like a physical assault, stealing his breath and numbing his extremities within seconds. He shouted into the wind, straining to hear a response, following the voice as best he could while the rope played out behind him. He found her 20 yards from the barn, collapsed in a snowdrift with her horse nowhere to be seen. Adelaide Winters, her face pale as the snow around her lips blue with cold, her eyes fluttering with the effort to stay conscious. She had been coming to check on her students in the outlying farms when the storm caught her, had lost her horse when the animal spooked at a lightning flash, had wandered blindly until she stumbled onto Hargrove land by pure chance or providence. "Hold on," Silas shouted over the wind, gathering her into his arms. "I've got you." The journey back to the barn was the longest 20 yards of his life. The rope guided him, but the wind fought every step, and Adelaide's weight, though slight, grew heavier as his strength flagged. By the time he reached the barn door, his hands were so numb he could barely work the latch. Elijah met them inside, his face white with fear, but his actions calm and purposeful. The boy had built up the fire in the cabin, had heated water, had gathered every blanket they owned. Together, uncle and nephew worked to warm Adelaide, removing her frozen outer garments and wrapping her in quilts, rubbing her hands and feet to restore circulation. Hours passed before she was out of danger. Silas sat by her bedside through the night, watching the color slowly return to her cheeks, listening to her breathing deepen from shallow gasps to steady rhythm. Elijah fell asleep in the chair by the fire, exhausted by fear and effort, but Silas could not rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Adelaide lying in that snowdrift, moments from death, and felt again the terror that had gripped him when he realized who he was rescuing. It was not the fear of losing a neighbor or a friend that had driven him through the blizzard. It was something deeper, more primal, more precious. Somewhere in the months since Elijah's arrival, since Adelaide had begun her visits with books and cookies and warm conversation, his carefully guarded heart had opened without his permission. When Adelaide's eyes finally fluttered open near dawn, Silas was still there, holding her hand in his face haggard with worry and sleeplessness. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice hoarse but wondering. "I couldn't let you go," he replied, and they both knew he was not talking only about the storm. Adelaide remained at the ranch for 3 days while the blizzard raged and then subsided, leaving behind drifts that reached the windowsills and a world transformed into crystalline white silence. During those days, something shifted between her and Silas, a barrier dissolving that neither had fully acknowledged existed. They talked for hours by the fire while Elijah read his books or practiced his letters. Conversations that ranged from childhood memories to hopes for their future, from the challenges of frontier life to the books they loved and the dreams they had buried. She told him about her journey west, how she had left a comfortable life in Boston to answer an advertisement for a teacher in Montana Territory. Her family had thought her mad, had warned her about the dangers and hardships that awaited, had predicted she would come running home within a year. That had been 5 years ago, and she had never once regretted her choice. "There's something about this land," she said, gazing out the frost-rimmed window at the endless white prairie. "It demands everything from you, strips away pretense and comfort and easy answers. But in return, it shows you who you really are. I couldn't go back to parlor conversations and afternoon teas after experiencing that kind of truth." Silas understood exactly what she meant. He had felt the same pull when he first came to Montana, the sense that this harsh and beautiful country would either break him or make him into something stronger than he had ever imagined possible. "Elizabeth felt it too," he said quietly, speaking his late wife's name aloud for the first time in years. "She used to say the prairie was like a mirror that reflected your soul back at you. She loved it here, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." Adelaide reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, a simple gesture of comfort that sent warmth spreading through his chest. "Tell me about her." So he did, haltingly at first, and then with growing ease, sharing memories he had kept locked away for so long that speaking them felt like releasing birds from a cage. He told Adelaide about Elizabeth's laugh, about her terrible cooking and her beautiful singing, about the way she had faced her final illness with courage that still humbled him. He told her about the emptiness that had followed, the years of merely existing rather than living, the walls he had built around his heart to protect himself from ever feeling such loss again. "And then Elijah came," Adelaide said softly, glancing at the boy who had fallen asleep over his book by the fire, "and everything changed." "Everything changed," Silas agreed. "He brought Daniel back to me in a way I never expected, and He hesitated, struggling to find words for feelings that still felt fragile and new. "He brought the possibility that I might not spend the rest of my life alone, that there might be more chapters in my story than I had allowed myself to imagine." Adelaide's eyes met his, green and warm and full of something that made his heart race like a young man's. "Silas Hargrove," she said, a smile playing at her lips, "are you trying to tell me something?" Before he could answer, Elijah stirred in his chair, the book sliding from his lap with a thump that startled them both. The moment passed, but the words that had almost been spoken hung in the air between them, a promise waiting to be fulfilled. When the roads finally cleared enough for travel, Silas hitched up the wagon and drove Adelaide back to town. The journey took twice as long as usual, the horses struggling through drifts that sometimes reached their bellies, but neither of them minded. They talked the whole way, the conversation flowing as easily as water, and when they finally reached her small house behind the schoolhouse, Silas found himself reluctant to say goodbye. "I should get back to Elijah," he said, making no move to leave. "You should," Adelaide agreed, also not moving. "The boy needs you." "He asked me something the other day." Silas turned his hat in his hands, a nervous habit he thought he had outgrown decades ago. "He asked if you might come for dinner sometime. Regular like," he said, "not just when you have books to deliver." A smile broke across Adelaide's face like sunrise over the mountains. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him I would ask. I told him it wasn't proper for a man to assume a lady would want to spend time with a worn-out rancher and his nephew. I told him there were probably plenty of younger, more suitable men who would object to such an arrangement." "Silas." Adelaide stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used. close enough that he could count the faint freckles scattered across her nose. "Ask me, Miss Winters." His voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. "Adelaide, would you do me the honor of coming to dinner, regular-like?" "I would be delighted, Mr. Hargrove." Her formality was undermined by the warmth in her eyes and the color rising in her cheeks. "Tell Elijah I will bring more cookies." The courtship that followed was slow and proper, conducted under the watchful eyes of Cedar Falls and the delighted supervision of Elijah, who took personal credit for bringing them together. Adelaide came for dinner every Sunday, and soon the visits extended to other days as well, her presence becoming as natural a part of the ranch as the mountains on the horizon or the cattle grazing in the fields. Spring arrived with its usual explosion of life, melting the snow and painting the prairie with wildflowers. Elijah thrived in school, his grades improving steadily, his circle of friends expanding to include children from ranches across the valley. Thomas, the boy who had invited him fishing, became his constant companion, and their adventures provided endless entertainment for the adults who watched them grow. One evening in late April, as the sun set in streaks of gold and pink over the mountains, Silas found Adelaide on the porch, watching the light change with an expression of peaceful contentment. Elijah was inside, ostensibly doing homework, but more likely reading the adventure novel he had hidden inside his mathematics book. "I love this time of day," Adelaide said as Silas settled into the chair beside her. "Everything feels possible when the light is this beautiful." Silas reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box he had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it, revealing a simple gold ring that had belonged to his mother. "Adelaide," he said, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I never thought I would ask this question again, never thought I would want to. But you and Elijah have taught me that life can surprise you, that love can find you even when you've stopped looking for it." He slid from his chair to kneel before her, the porch boards hard beneath his knee, the ring catching the last light of the setting sun. "Will you marry me? Will you be my wife and a mother to Elijah, and build a life with us on this land that has already given me so much more than I deserve?" Adelaide's answer came not in words but in action. She slid from her chair to kneel beside him on the weathered porch boards, her hands cupping his face with a tenderness that made his throat tighten. Her eyes glistened with tears, but the smile breaking across her features told him everything he needed to know before she spoke. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Silas Hargrove, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his mother's ring that had waited in a drawer for decades to find its purpose again, and then he kissed her for the first time. It was a gentle kiss, almost reverent, the promise of a lifetime sealed in a single moment of connection. Behind them, the screen door creaked open, and they turned to find Elijah standing there with a grin so wide it threatened to split his face. "Does this mean she's staying?" he asked, barely containing his excitement. "This means she's staying," Silas confirmed, rising and pulling Adelaide up with him. "If she'll have us, both of us, with all our rough edges and burnt coffee and muddy boots." "I'll have you," Adelaide laughed, reaching out to draw Elijah into their embrace. "Rough edges and all, though we may need to work on that coffee situation." The wedding took place in June, when the prairie was carpeted with wildflowers and the mountains wore their brightest green. The whole town turned out for the ceremony, crowding into the small church where Reverend Thomas presided with obvious delight. Silas stood at the altar in a suit he had not worn since Elizabeth's funeral, feeling simultaneously ancient and reborn, watching Adelaide walk toward him on her father's arm. The man had traveled from Boston for the occasion, his initial skepticism about his daughter's frontier life melting away as he witnessed the community that had embraced her and the man who clearly adored her. Elijah served as ring-bearer, his face solemn with the importance of his role, carrying the simple gold bands on a small pillow Adelaide had embroidered for the occasion. When the moment came to exchange vows, Silas found his voice steady and sure, speaking promises he had never thought to make again with a conviction that came from the deepest part of his heart. "I, Silas, take thee, Adelaide, to be my wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do us part. The words were traditional, spoken by countless couples before them, and countless more to come. But as Silas said them, looking into Adelaide's eyes, they felt entirely new, entirely theirs, a covenant forged in the specific circumstances of their unlikely love story. The reception was held at the ranch, tables set up in the yard under a sky so blue it seemed painted by a divine hand. Neighbors brought dishes to share, children ran laughing through the fields, and music drifted across the prairie from a fiddle played by old Mr. Carmichael, whose arthritic fingers still remembered the tunes of his youth. Silas danced with his bride as the sun set, both of them laughing at their own clumsiness, neither caring about the steps as long as they were together. Later that evening, after the guests had departed and Elijah had been tucked into bed, Silas and Adelaide sat on the porch watching the stars emerge one by one. The letter, Daniel's letter, lay between them on the small table, its presence a reminder of the chain of events that had brought them to this moment. "I think he would be happy," Adelaide said softly, nodding toward the letter. "Your brother. I think he would be glad to know that his final act brought so much good into the world." Silas picked up the worn paper, running his thumb over Daniel's handwriting one more time. "He asked me to take care of his boy, to teach him to be better than he was. But Elijah already is better. He was better from the moment he showed up on my porch, carrying this letter like it was holy scripture, believing that somewhere in the world there was a kind man waiting to give him a home." "He found one," Adelaide said, leaning her head against Silas's shoulder, "the kindest man I know." The years that followed were not without hardship. The frontier demanded its due, and there were droughts and blizzards, sick cattle and failed crops, the endless struggle to wrest a living from land that gave nothing freely. But through it all, the little family that had formed so unexpectedly proved stronger than any challenge that arose. Elijah grew tall and strong, inheriting his father's charm and his uncle's steadiness in equal measure. He excelled in school, eventually earning a scholarship to a college back east, where he studied law with the intention of returning it to Montana to help the ranchers and farmers who had raised him. Adelaide continued teaching, expanding her school to accommodate the growing population of Cedar Falls, earning a reputation that drew families to the area specifically for the education their children would receive. And Silas, the solitary rancher who had resigned himself to a life of isolation, found that his capacity for love had not diminished with age but had grown, encompassing wife and nephew, and eventually the two daughters Adelaide bore him, girls with their mother's green eyes and their father's stubborn determination. On the mantel above the fireplace, beside the daguerreotype of Elizabeth that would always hold its honored place, there now stood other photographs, other memories, other chapters in a story that continued to unfold. And in a place of special prominence, framed in simple wood that Silas had carved himself, hung Daniel's letter, the words that had set everything in motion, the last gift from a brother who had found redemption in death by sending his son to find love in life. "Mama said to give this to a kind man," Elijah had whispered on that long-ago October evening. He had traveled across a continent on the strength of that instruction, trusting that such a man existed, believing that family was worth any journey, any hardship, any risk. He had been right, and in finding Silas, he had given far more than he received, opening a door that had been locked for too long, letting light into a heart that had forgotten what warmth felt like. The letter had been Daniel's final message, but the family it created was his lasting legacy, proof that love could survive death, that hope could survive loss, that even the most broken stories could find their way to a happy ending. Outside the window, the prairie stretched endlessly toward the horizon, vast and challenging and full of possibilities. And in the small ranch house where three lost souls had found each other, a fire burned warm against the darkness, and the future shone bright with promise.